welcome back to another video again. Trying this one out, changing things up and trying to keep these videos not too long all in one sitting. So now we're going to talk about explorers in particular and start with some of the ramifications of these interactions. So here we go. First one, Hernan Cortez. He lands... He's got some... The more you read about this, the more interesting it gets, just how crazy of a story this is. He's married to the daughter or niece, I think it is, of the governor of Cuba, and gets some money to fund an expedition into Mexico. And as he's preparing, the Spanish crown as well as the Cuban governor order him to not go. And he basically waits like 4 more days and says, I didn't hear anything, and sailed anyway. So already he's mutinying or disregarding orders of the crown, which makes him kind of like, treason and stuff. So he lands in near present-day Veracruz, Mexico, and had some wealth to his name, as well as a lot of people who didn't like him. So he marched on Tenochtitlan, something. You get the idea. You will look it up. Tenochtitlan. He marched on this town in 1519 with 600 soldiers, 15 horsemen, and 15 cannon. So when you think about the size of this force, we're talking, soldiers plus the horsemen plus the cannon. I mean, less than 1,000 troops, easily less than 1,000. Looking more like 700 soldiers, all said and done. He encountered some resistance to him marching by Aztec tributaries until they started realizing that they're enemies of the Aztecs. And a lot of these tributaries around them were like, wait a minute, you're fighting the Aztecs? Welcome aboard. They were all on board. And so they then started welcoming Cortez as this liberator of these Aztecs who demanded tribute and human sacrifices and all kinds of mess. Now, whether the scale of how much they were demanding in tribute is accurate, we have to think about the purposes behind these tales and why these numbers are so bad. It's also that the Spanish were trying to make it look like the Aztecs were as bad as they say, rather than just, accurate numbers. Because look, if they're killing something like, I think one person did the calculation of 800 people daily, or something like, some was saying like it was 6 people dead a minute, and I'm making these numbers up right now. But they did calculations of how many people dead would that have to be, and how many in that ceremony. So either way, having the frequency of those numbers is catastrophically high and very improbable, despite the high population in that region. So anyway, they go in there, and he enters Tenochtitlan by welcome of Montezuma II, thinking that Montezuma would learn the Spanish's weaknesses and attack him later. That was the idea behind at least what Montezuma was thinking. Moctezuma also gave them gold and appeased the Spanish as much as they can. The problem was when it's like give a mouse a cookie. If you give Spanish gold, they're going to want more gold later and want more and more and more. And that's exactly what happens. The Spanish are like, okay, dude. There was a Spanish army invading Cortez. So he had to march his troops back to fight a Spanish army of 1,100 men to depose him. Since he openly mutinied against the expedition, he actually defeated the army, and those that were defeated were given the opportunity to join him. So now he's joined by, let's say, 800 of those men, and he returns to Tenochtitlan to see the city in open rebellion against the Spanish, because the Spanish were still trying to occupy Tenochtitlan with a short amount of troops. And so we don't know the details, but one of the ruling Spaniards may have killed Montezuma on his own, or people had stoned him It's disputed on who killed Moctezuma at the end. Uh, Cortez, hearing about this rebellion, gathers forces in Tlaxcala, which isn't there. It's around here somewhere. And they give him some troops, reinforcements from Quito, and some estimate his army could be as high as 10,000. So we're talking about 10% were Spanish, up to words of 100,000 troops all joining to bring down the Aztecs. And in that case, that would mean the Spanish made up 1% of that army. He reconquers and then completely destroys Tenochtitlan, rebuilds as Mexico City, and establishes a new Spain. So, if anything you learn from this video is that the story that the Spanish were these conquerors based on all the cool stuff that they have on their own, weapons, guns, bombs, all that stuff, it doesn't hold up. There's no way they could have stopped the scale of these armies. We're talking about population centers of anywhere from 20 to 30 million pre-contact. So the fact that they think that the Spanish with 800 troops did this is quite improbable and more than likely very inaccurate. So he does take over. This is Malinche. She was a slave to the Aztecs that they freed and then basically were with Cortez as his wife. She has a son who then resents Cortez, but also becomes like a major leader and stuff too. So seen as a hero of the Mexican people in a sense. You still see the symbols of the Aztecs today, and particularly with the eagle holding a cactus and snake, I believe, which is the symbol in Mexico. Cortez also destroyed his own ships when he first landed to make sure that his troops couldn't retreat. But once again, all the sources and contact we have about any of this comes strictly from the Spanish documents or from archaeological evidence and whatnot. But we don't have archaeological evidence of the conquest because no one's just sitting there writing as everyone's being killed. So a lot of the manuscripts and stuff we have are post-conquest. So the other guy is by the name of Francisco Pizarro. And this scene's pretty grim and dismal too. Also, we got to challenge the notion that, one, that the Spanish were solely the conquerors of these people, and two, that the natives here were these innocent bystanders who were just these nature-loving, good people who did nothing about themselves. There's no good and bad in any of this. This is just how life was, and there was bad things going on in the Inca, just as there was bad things going on in the Spanish. And actually, if you want to learn about a different way of ruling, the Inca's history is pretty cool. The book is 1491 if you ever want to look it up. That was a really cool read. Anyway, Pizarro had 3 failed expeditions into South America, and every one of them basically resulted in resistance by the native peoples. And that's what you can see in his 3 expeditions here. Until he finally enters Peru in 1532. And what's going on as he enters Peru is Atahualpa, the 14th Inca, just got rule over the empire. And Inca are actually not the individual people, but the leaders. An Inca is one of the revered leaders, or actually like a god to the people. And when you are propped up there, you are the god. Now, the Inca king, or the emperor, the Inca person, had many wives. And so you generally had 30 to 40 sons vying for power around his death or for his approval. And what you would do is you would preserve your ancestor who was an Inca. So, if my dad was king and I become the next king or the next Inca, I want to preserve dad's corpse because that's a god on earth. And so you had these litters of these preserved bodies of the former Inca that different family factions would keep in mind and say, look, this is our god on our side, so you got to listen to him too. So there was a lot of infighting and a civil war with the death of the last Inca, including the heir dying as well, causing a massive civil war. And Atahualpa is the leader and winner, even though he wasn't the first pick, or I think the pick of the previous one. But with the disease that came from Spanish contact, it ravaged all of the people, including killing the king. So Atahualpa's finally in control and power. He's celebrating and recuperating after some very nasty losses, fights, and illness in one of his private retreats. So there weren't any soldiers where he was, and he invites this foreigner to come and see. And as they're coming in, they're walking by, I would say, something like a 50,000 man army is right outside where they are. So Atahualpa meets Pizarro and northern Peru, and Atahualpa refuses submission to the Spanish. Now, Pizarro shows up and has 110 foot soldiers, 67 cavalry, 3 guns, and 2 cannon that were set up in this square. And they wanted to at least convert the troops, convert Atahualpa and the Inca first. So they have a priest to give a Bible, and the Inca actually don't have a written script at all. They had these knots that were used for different writing systems, but record keeping, and it was rope and knotted in a long line, and that was a way of communication. They've never seen a book before, so they give him a Bible, and Atahualpa looks at it and is like, I don't know what to do with this, and throws it on the ground. And the priest was like, oh my gosh, you just threw the Bible on the ground, you're going to hell. And says to Pizarro's like, I have no way of converting him because he doesn't want the word of God. So they open fire, muskets and cannon, not to mention horses drawn in, and massacre everybody and all around Atahualpa. Even worse, he's considered a god on earth, so his standard bearers are the ones that are holding his litter, which is this throne that he stands on. And they couldn't let the Inca hit the ground. I mean, like a flag. Like he's too sacred. You carried around a litter. And if one of them was slaughtered and the weight was falling, they had to have another one come up. I mean, even in the face of death, that was an honor to hold his litter. And finally, once all of them were slaughtered, did Atahualpa realize his danger, because he thought he was okay. The 6,000 guards around him were all massacred. He promises Pizarro 2 rooms full of gold and one of gold and 2 of silver for his ransom, and paid it. And Pizarro took all of that and then still kind of held him, and then basically put Atahualpa at the mercy of the people, who then put him on trial for killing his brother, which was during the Civil War, the favored of the 2 heirs. And other charges were against him, and he basically had his throat slit by the Spanish. And that is how Atahualpa fell. So, what happens next? And here's the video of a scene from Guns, Germs, and Steel.
On November 15th, 1532, Pizarro's band of adventurers enters the valley of Cajamarca. They've been told that Atahualpa is waiting for them here, but they're not prepared for the sight that greets them. In the hills beyond the town of Cajamarca is the Imperial Inca army, 80,000 men in full battle order. The conquistadors' own journals bear witness to their first impressions.
Their camp looked like a very beautiful city. We'd seen nothing like it in the Indies until then, and it scared us, because we were so few and so deep in this land.
Pizarro sends a party of his best horsemen into the heart of the Inca camp. They are led by Captain de Soto. They are gambling that Atahualpa will allow them to pass through the camp unharmed, and agree to meet them.
Soto's visit had a very important psychological purpose: to intimidate the Inca in front of his people, challenging him with the horse. Atahualpa at first didn't react to Soto's presence, as if nobody had entered the room. Once the horse comes eye to eye with the Inca is still calm, showing that the horse has no impact on him, calling Soto's bluff.
The captain advanced so close that the horse's nostrils disturbed the fringe on the Inca's forehead. But the Inca never moved.
And then, after a brief silence, comes Atahualpa's explosion. He was telling them, the time has come for you to pay. I understand this as the time has come for you to pay with your lives.
Pakaring, umalik ni kichiswan tupasak. Umalik ni kichiswan.
Soto, I understand, was nervous enough to come back with fear to the camp. And as we know, the Spaniards spent the night before in extreme fear.
The conquistadors have made their camp in the town of Cajamarca. Many of them are now convinced they are facing oblivion. 168 soldiers, 1,000 miles from any other Spaniard, facing an army of 80,000 Incas.
Few of us slept that night. We kept watch in the square, from where we could see the campfires of the Indian army. It was a fearful sight, like a brilliantly star-studded night.
Pizarro and his most trusted officers debate their options for how to deal with Atahualpa. Some advise caution, but Pizarro insists their best chance is to launch a surprise attack the next day. It's a tactic that's worked successfully in the past. 12 years before Pizarro went to Peru, another famous conquistador, Hernán Cortés, had gone to Mexico and encountered another formidable civilization, the Aztecs. He conquered the country by kidnapping the Aztec leader and exploiting the ensuing chaos. It's the morning of November 16th, 1532. Atahualpa has agreed to meet the Spaniards in the town of Cajamarca and sends his entourage ahead of him. But he makes a fateful decision, that his soldiers should not carry weapons.
The Indians were musicians and dancers. They were soldiers, but unarmed. Why would Atahualpa unarm his own soldiers? Why? Because he was in a festivity. He was celebrating. He wasn't going to war. He was going for a celebration so that the whole people could see how the alleged gods would run away in fear. The fact that some people believed that the Spaniards were gods would play better in the hands of Atahualpa's purpose. If I know they are not gods and I defeat the gods, then of course everybody will be with me. But what if I defeat the gods with no show of force at all? Then I am beyond the gods.
While Atahualpa and his men enter Cajamarca, the Spaniards are waiting, hidden from view.
There were 5,000 or 6,000 men, and behind them the figure of Atahualpa seated on a very fine litter, lined with feathers and embellished with gold and silver. Many of us pissed ourselves out of sheer terror.
The square is filled with Atahualpa's people, but there's not one Spaniard outside. Atahualpa asks, "Where are these dogs?" One of his right hands answers, "They have run away because they are afraid of the magnificent Inca." Of course, the whole crowd listened to this and believed that this was the case.
Me presento ante vosotros en nombre de la cristiandad.
Pizarro sends out his priest to confront Atahualpa.
Para enseñaros el camino de la verdad.
The conquistadors are obliged to try and convert native people before any resort to violence.
Pinkanki sunkasapa. Mokakakani intech churingmi. Mokankani intitaitach churing. Manang imaparruanay kichu kay peja.
Mi poder procede de mi Señor. Sus palabras están escritas en este libro.
Imankaipi.
Atahualpa has never seen a book before. He doesn't know what to do with it.
Imankay. Manang imapaschu keja. Manang rimas kaiki kay picanchu.
¿Cómo te atreves, indio perro? ¡Salgan, españoles! ¡Destruyen a estos perros que no respetan las cosas de Dios! ¡Santiago, a ellos!
At that moment, with the crowd absolutely unprepared, the horses come. There was massive panic.
Just imagine the scene in Cajamarca. The Incas hadn't seen horses before, and these aren't ordinary horses, these are Spanish horses. Fierce, big, fighting horses. They could get in amongst men, they would trample men, and they made the most excellent platform. From the horse, you could stab down to the left, stab down to the right. You could cut, you could scythe, hacking all about you. If only the Incas had known that what you had to do against cavalry was stand firm, then they'd have been all right. They had superior numbers, but they didn't know that. They fled, they broke ranks, and then the horsemen could get in amongst them, and they cut them down. There was an Inca god called Viracocha, and he was a white man, and he was the god of thunder. And they thought these men with their arquebuses were the very incarnation of Viracocha.
The Inca force was in his litter, helped by his carriers. As soon as they were able to do it, the Spaniards went after the litter. And they started killing the carriers. One carrier would fall, and another one would replace him. Only at the very, very, very end of the tragedy, the litter started to move because there were no more carriers left.
As the litter falls, Pizarro himself captures Atahualpa. His plan has worked to perfection. Atahualpa is taken to a makeshift prison in the royal quarters at Cajamarca.
He thought we were going to kill him, but we told him no. Christians only kill in the heat of the battle.
Outside, thousands of Incas are dead. The rest of the army has retreated to the hills. In spite of a massive imbalance in numbers, Spanish horses, swords, and strategy have proved decisive. But the Spaniards possessed another weapon they didn't even know they had. A weapon of mass destruction that had marched invisibly ahead of them.
Okay, so what happens next is the Portuguese take these places. Most of them can't take inroads of the places they conquer. Instead, particularly trading empires of the Dutch and the Portuguese, they take cities and that's it. All they really do, though, is they replace the trade going on in the Indian Ocean. They don't do anything special other than it's new management. No new trade routes. Because mostly what happens here is, let's see if I can find an Indian Ocean image. Oh, well, we can do this one. Most of what's going on is, this is where all the trade is still happening. And what really would go in is, you would have Portuguese and Dutch boats go in there, and they would go back and forth trading for a while. And then after they've made enough money, they would buy what they can from India and go home and sell all of the spices and trading goods there and make their money. So this is probably one of the most important things to understand is none of this really changed the Indian Ocean trade system. It's just now you had Portuguese and Dutch trying to establish trading cities to eventually bring stuff back. But most of the runs going back and forth were simple little trading agreements done by the Portuguese and the Dutch and then coming back after up to 2 years. So that's the major thing. It wasn't a major change. Now, the next thing that's a huge deal is the Columbian Exchange. First off, the biggest deal is the diseases introduced to the New World kill up to almost 90% of the population. There's still a lot of debate as to how many people really died. Revisionists in history are debating over what exactly did that counted and how many people that was, whether that was 45 million people because there was 50 living in the Americas, whether it was something more like 30 million people roughly died. A lot of it's looking at whether or not the Spanish and Europeans are responsible for all of these deaths and their level of responsibility, and getting into defensive of, well, this isn't the first group, or some of the things I've even heard was like, well, they weren't indigenous either. And so there's a big push to find that the people that eventually inhabit North and South America were actually coming through Alaska and Asia in the, we now think were the 15th to 17th millennia, or 15 to 17,000 years ago, prior to the land bridge that was by ice. So I know it gets all into it, but there's a lot of historical debate over the number of people that were killed, and also some more or less unkind reasons for it. So we do know diseases. Smallpox is one, but more likely it's probably just, other things like measles and other common contagions that spread. And what happens is a total societal breakdown. Usually they say a population can sustain itself anywhere from 1% to 3% of the population dying and nothing really changes. It's when it gets higher than that that you start seeing shortages, needs, problems, things not being met. Particularly that happens during the Black Death, where 1/3 to 1/4 of Europeans were killed. So you had breakdowns in who can do what. And here you have anywhere from, let's just say 50 to 80% dying by disease, and then the remainder die from starvation or exposure or just inability. Like they couldn't maintain their society. And so here's what would happen is, once your tribe was obliterated by this disease and you survived, you went to another tribe who would take you in because they too would understand those difficulties. And man, you just survived, except they're carrying it. And then that tribe gets it, and people get wiped out. And that's how it starts moving to the interior. So by the 1600s, and the English are showing up, they're like, oh my goodness, look at all this farmland. No one's using it? Goodness, these Indians are stupid. They didn't even use this land. When reality was, they did. That's farmland because they were farming it. And the population was just completely obliterated. This is called the Great Dying. Most think it was also combinations of chickenpox, influenza, and measles. Estimates are all based on what are called virgin soil disease exposure, meaning these diseases Eurasians continued or had exposure to pre-history. Most of these diseases, like for example, influenza, comes from exposure to birds, I believe. And so that's how we get mutations, is through contact with generally poultry. When humans started domesticating cows, chickens, horses, pigs, and sheep, there were disease transfers and dying amounts, but we don't know that. We don't know the numbers because it was before history, before written text, because this was just starting the agricultural revolution. So we don't know. We just base it on an unexposed area and how bad that is. Now, mosquitoes, rats, and malaria all come over too. And so other spreads through those contacts, because rats were mostly in the ships as well. There's mosquitoes and fetid water and whatnot. The other big deal, though, were food transfers, particularly cows, pigs, chickens, and horses. You're going to see like the amount of grazing used for the Americas is going to change. South America's got massive amounts of cattle grazing, just like the American West. You'll see feral pigs will eventually... a pig can go feral after 2 generations. It starts growing tusks and fur and all that stuff. So that's what a boar is. And they start wrecking Native American cropland because they've never had to encounter boar. And now you have these things that could be 8 to 10 feet. And massive animals that can do all that. You have horse cultures starting emerging because the introduction of the horse by the Spanish. But before that, there were no Native Americans on the range with horses. That was a post-1500s encounter. Fruits and grains, particularly sugar and coffee, come over, whereas citrus, peaches, and bananas as well come into the Americas and are fully developed, used, all kinds of stuff. And then you have the enslaved Africans that would come over. They would be bringing over their own traditional foods, particularly of okra and rice. And then the New World brought its own set of foods back to Europe, particularly potatoes, tomatoes, and tobacco, which become major hits. Then peanuts, cacao, chocolate, pumpkins, squashes, yams, cassava, spicy peppers. They called it pepper because it had the same kind of zing as ground pepper, but that confusion still plagues us even today. One of the articles you already read was debating whether or not syphilis came over from the Americas, as the first recorded histories of syphilis exposure happens in the 1500s, particularly 1494 do we see it in Italy. And so by Spanish mercenaries being all around, they could have brought it after first exposure to the Native Americans. So what happens overall? You see diets improve in Afro-Eurasia. You have better nutrition for the world. For Afro-Eurasia, the amount of food produced in terms of calories, the variety of foods able to be produced and available easily will change diets and improve health incredibly. Think of Italian food without tomatoes. Think of Chinese food without chili peppers. Indian, German, Italian, and Irish food without potatoes. These become staples. Potatoes can be grown so easily and so much calorie per take. It's why wouldn't they be eating them? Corn is now able to be harvested in areas that were not available to rice. So all kinds of things have been transferred. And oops, I didn't even show you all the other maps. So here's diseases, and showing you just an idea of scale of what smallpox looked on the Native American population. There's the estimates, particularly this one here is of the population collapse in Mexico alone. So estimates in the Mexican Valley, 22 million people reduced down to about 1.8 by 1600. Just to show you how devastating these populations were. So it's like, wow, it's really easy for them to kill them all. Well, they didn't do much of it. It was the diseases and whatnot. And then the food transfers once again. So that's this video, and next we'll go into the empires themselves for the maritime empires, and hopefully that might be the last video because these things I know are running a bit. So have fun.